So my name's Quaida Harding. Just as of this semester, I'm the former president of the Beekeeping Club. We have nominated our new president, Amalia Frias, as well. So the U of U Beekeepers Association would like to welcome our honorary guest, Dr. Joseph Wilson. Dr. Wilson is an associate professor at Utah State University, Tooele, teaching several classes, labs, and studying several aspects of ecology, evolution, and conservation of bees and wasps. He graduated from Utah State with a BS in biology in 2005 and then going on to get a PhD in biology in 2010.
So Dr. Wilson's research is a fusion of two distinct components. One, investigating the history of diversification through phylogenetic and population genetic analyses using traditional molecular data and genome-level data sets. And two, examining the spatiotemporal patterns of biodiversity within and between distinct habitat types through faunal surveys and ecological niche modeling to identify threats to the future of biodiversity. Dr. Wilson is also the author of The Bees in Our Backyard, so let's give him a round of applause.
I just noticed I need to reorganize my microphone because it was pointing away from me. Can you guys hear me in the back? I saw yeses. Thank you guys for inviting me. I love to talk about bees, and so this is my favorite part of my job. I'm Joe Wilson. I'm at Utah State University in Tooele. How many of you knew there was a Utah State University in Tooele? It looked like 5. I didn't know either until I got the job there. And I went to Utah State up in Logan for most all my degrees, in fact. So that's where I'm at. I'll just give you a slide showing you some of the things that I'm interested in. I have broad interests, but I've narrowed them down to mostly bees and wasps here. I've done a lot with velvet ants. This is a nocturnal velvet ant. Most people probably didn't know there were nocturnal velvet ants, but there's several hundred species. That's a male. I like bees and wasps because they're really cool. I like taking pictures of bees. Most of my work is with my field crew, which is also my kids. This is my youngest daughter. She's looking at something in the water while I'm waiting to catch bees. So I do like bees a lot. I want to take maybe 2 minutes to talk about velvet ants. Velvet ants are a wingless wasp. They're not really an ant. They're my other favorite bug, or my other favorite group of bugs. Velvet ants are cool. This graph is kind of confusing, but it's showing velvet ants have the longest stinger to body ratio out of any bee, wasp, or ant. There's the velvet ant sting coming out. This video here shows a velvet ant trying to sting me. You can see it's not only long, but it's also a really agile sting. So it can kind of move its abdomen all around and sting you no matter where you're grabbing it at. In addition to their long sting, they have one of the most painful venoms, I hear. I don't let them sting me. But people that do let them sting them say they're one of the most painful stings. They have a really hard cuticle, so if you're a lizard, you can't crush them. The lizard will bite them. It can't break it in half or squish it, so it gets stung in the mouth and it remembers not to do it again. They also squeak. They have a cool squeaking sound if you bug them. So velvet ants are cool. Probably the coolest wasp in the world, I would say. They're also really colorful, which always makes them kind of attractive and fun. They're a big mimicry complex, so most of the velvet ants in Utah look kind of like this, orangish, reddish, and fuzzy. Most of the velvet ants down in the Mojave Desert, there's lots of white ones. Down in northern Mexico, they're whatever color you want to call that, colorful. So there's lots of really cool stuff with velvet ants, but we're not talking about that today. We're talking about bees. I'm going to re-put this slide up, or a version of this slide at the end. So if you have more questions or more things that I didn't get to answer today, you can check out my book or various social media sites that me and my co-author, Olivia, we maintain some of this at certain times of the year. Right now I'm kind of lazy with the social media, but there's a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about, or maybe some peripheral stuff that I will be talking about today. So I usually start these talks by doing a survey, and I've done this survey lots of times, and I've done it around the country, but I'm going to ask this question: how important are bees? And I'm sure I know what the answer is going to be. We're going to do it with our hands on a scale of 1 to 5. If you think they're not important, you put a 1 finger up. If you think they're really important, you put 5 fingers up. Are you ready for the survey? How important are bees? I'm just seeing if there's anything but 5s. So, I mean, it's kind of expected, right? This crowd especially, we would expect people to think bees are important. I did this survey, I did it online, and so you never know quite what you're going to get online, but 99% of the people that responded said bees are important. I don't know who the 1% is, that didn't think bees were important, but basically everybody knows that bees are important. This is really encouraging. As a conservation biologist, I don't need to convince people that bees are important, right? People already realize that they are. The problem is people need to maybe be a little bit more informed about what a bee is and their importance. So these are two posters I found on the internet. Sometimes when I get bored, I Google "save the bees" or something like that, and I find some fun things. This is from the same artist. What's wrong with this first poster? It says, "Save the bees, save humanity." What's wrong with it? That's not a bee, it's a wasp. It's actually a yellow jacket. Nobody says save the yellow jackets to save humanity. I don't like yellow jackets myself, even though they're very cool wasps. So that's one problem here. Another problem is this: 30% of our food is pollinated by bees. We have that same dead yellow jacket under there. The other problem is this is corn, and corn is wind pollinated. So pretty much nothing about this poster is right. I put some of these posters on Twitter once, and the Natural Resources Defense Council tweeted me back and said, "Where did you get those?" And I was like, I just Googled them. And they said, "Those aren't ours." So what it turns out is there was a designer that was doing some, I like the artwork. It's really pretty cool artwork, right? This designer made these posters part of his portfolio, put the Natural Resources Defense Council logo on there as an example of what you could do with it. And so these are basically, it's just somebody on the internet making mistakes. And that's okay. We can give people the freedom to make mistakes, right? It's not only just random internet people that make mistakes. I was at a entomology conference a couple years ago. Since I have little kids with me in the field, I like to look at the little kids book. This one was Exploring the World of Bees. And I opened it up to the first page, well, fourth page, Meet the Bees. And there's a big picture of, what is that? That's a fly. It's not a bee. So even people that should know better make mistakes. I'm not going to blame the author here. I'm guessing it was the publisher that found some. Usually the publisher will go to some photo sharing site and look for some photo they can use. And so the photographer probably labeled this bee, and the publisher apparently didn't know better. So I often just to give you a fair warning, I changed my talk about 2 hours ago. I knew what I was going to talk about, and then a couple hours ago I was like, I'm going to talk about something else. Usually when I do these talks, I spend a lot of time talking about what's the difference between a bee and a wasp and a fly. So I'm just going to briefly touch on this in case you really wanted that part of this talk. So we have a fly and we have a bee. There's lots of flies that look like bees. Here's one right here. We know it's a fly because it's labeled fly. What differences do you see between the bee there and the fly? Physical differences. How can you tell them apart? The eyes, what's different about the eyes? The fly's eyes are really big, the bee's eyes are not as big. Very good. What else do you see? The antenna. Longer antenna on the bees. Oops, I gave it away. Short antenna on the fly. What else do you see? Someone said wings. What about the wings? They look different. They do look different. So in this case, what was that? There's only 2 on the fly. There's 4 on the bee. Hard to tell, though, because the bee is folding its wings over its back. Let's see, I have one more characteristic, and I'm just going to push the button so we can see it. The legs are also fairly telling. A lot of bees have big, hairy legs. The flies, the ones especially that look like bees, don't usually have big, hairy legs. So when I'm in my front yard, I can ask my kids, because I'm raising bee geeks on purpose, I can tell them, I can look at one of these flies, and I can say, is that a bee or a fly? And they look at the head. I asked my son, who's 10, and he says he always looks at the head because he can look at the eyes and the antenna, and it's a good giveaway. Are you ready for a quiz? Is that a bee or a fly? How do you know it's a fly? Has big eyes, has one set of wings, little antennas, skinny legs. Look at all that stuff. Easy, right? One more. This one's a little bit trickier. Pop quiz. Bee or a fly? So this one, I purposefully put it in here to trick you, because those characteristics that we just named, they're not always consistently perfect. This, if you look at the head, is a fly. See those short antennas, those really big eyes? But you're thinking to yourself, but that has hairy legs. This is a robber fly. It's a predatory fly. It kills bees, and it looks a lot like a bee. But those hairs on the legs are not for collecting pollen. They're just to trick potential predators. But the head, again, gives it away. So I'm going to move away from flies now. We're pretty much experts. Let's do wasps. And so I'm not going to spend the same amount of time because it's complicated, but we have a bee here in the corner. We have 3 wasps. When I ask people the characteristics, they usually say something like this. Wasps have a skinny waist. There's an extreme version. They say wasps have thin legs. These are thin and kind of spiky, unlike the flies, which were thin and smooth. And then they say that wasps usually don't have very much hair, right? There's a kind of a hairy-ish wasp, but it's nothing compared to that bee. So those are pretty good characteristics to separate bees from wasps. The problem is, well, let's do a pop quiz first. Are you ready? on the left, is that a bee or a wasp? It's a wasp. It looks waspy. It has all those characteristic skinny legs, smooth, it looks like a wasp. And you're right, it is a wasp. But the problem is, these are all bees. A lot of these bees have those same wasp characteristics. Looks waspy, skinny waist, not very hairy legs. So how do you tell the difference? Well, there is one physical difference, and I'm not going to focus on that because you have to zoom in microscopically at some of the little hairs. The big difference that I want to focus on is their diet. So wasps are meat eaters, generally. Bees are pollen eaters, generally. There are a few exceptions, but in general, wasps are eating meat. I include insects as meat. So wasps are hunters. They hunt insects. And bees are browsers. They hunt pollen. Bees feed their babies pollen and nectar. Wasps feed their babies meat. This wasp has killed a katydid in my front yard, and now it is taking a ball of katydid guts back to its babies to feed them. So you're at your barbecue. There's something buzzing around you, and you wave your hand around and you say, I hate, what do you hate? Wasps. You hate wasps. It's not a bee. It's one of my pet peeves as a bee geek. You don't hate bees when they're flying around your barbecue because those aren't bees. What is that wasp doing at your barbecue? It's looking for meat. If you let it, it will sit on your hamburger, it will carve a little piece of your hamburger off, and it will go back and feed its babies, and probably tell its sisters where to come and get more hamburger. So, wasps are carnivores, bees are herbivores. A lot of people want to save the bees. This is an encouraging movement. We know people care about them. We know people think they're important, and there's lots of efforts to save the bees. Some of these efforts are somewhat misguided. A lot of people are focusing on this bee here, which is the honeybee. I want to just focus on that Cheerios one. Have you guys heard about this? Cheerios, the bee went missing. See how he's gone? You could actually write into Cheerios, and they'd send wildflower seeds to you to help save or help bring back the bees. That didn't last very long because a lot of people wrote into Cheerios and said, oh, those wildflower seeds that you're sending, they're invasive in certain parts of the country. And if you think about it, a flower that might grow well in Florida might not be the best flower to put in California, or the one from California might not do well in Salt Lake City. So there's not like a one-size-fits-all way to save the bees. But it's an encouraging movement. The thing that I want to help you to be informed about today is that if we just focus on this bee right here, the European honeybee, we're missing part of the story. Because there are other bees out there. For example, this is a little fairy bee, one of my favorite kind of bees. You can see it doesn't really look like the honeybee, and in fact, it doesn't act like the honeybee. So we're going to spend some time, I was going to say this morning, but this afternoon, talking about the differences between honeybees and some of these other bees. So people don't necessarily realize that honeybees are pretty different than all the other bees in North America. I call them the black sheep of the bee world. That is a black sheep. And black sheep are not bad. It just means they're different than other sheep, right? And the honeybee is different than other bees. So let's talk about some of those differences. So I'm going to classify things oversimplistically. I'm calling these honeybees, which is true, and I'm calling the other ones wild bees. And I'll talk a little bit about the diversity of these wild bees. But so we have honeybees and wild bees. You will probably hear me use another term for these wild bees. I often call them native bees. Honeybees are not native to North America. They're native to Eurasia and Africa. They were brought here by European settlers several hundred years ago. So I make the distinction that we have native bees, bees that evolved here, with the flowers that evolved here. And then we have the European honeybee, which didn't evolve here, but it has been here for several hundred years. Also, I forgot to say this part. Honeybees, they're not only not native to North America, but they have been interacting with humans in various ways for a long time. This is an Egyptian hieroglyphic. They say that's a honeybee. As an entomologist, I think it looks more like a parasitic wasp. But there's some artist freedom right there. But they have the Egyptians did raise honeybees, so to speak. There's even an older cave painting from, eastern Spain that has this painting of someone climbing up a ladder and harvesting honey, which is pretty cool. So humans have interacted with bees in kind of maybe a mutualistic way for a long time. Mutualistic is with quotes because it wasn't always good for the bees. So we also have a distinction. Honeybees, you might know, live in big colonies. There's a queen and workers. There's a division of labor, so there's different workers doing different tasks. Most of the native bees we have in North America are solitary bees. So this is a single bee, lives by herself. She is the queen and the worker all at once. So I also use that term quite a bit. Native bee, solitary bee, wild bee, they're all interchangeable in my mind because most of the bees are solitary bees. While most of the North American bees are solitary, sometimes they live in a big group. So this is a nesting aggregation of a solitary bee. This is a kind of a digger bee. These specific ones build chimneys over the nest entrance. We're not exactly sure why. It could be to reduce parasitism. It could be to help them find their nest in this crowded community. But you can see that individual bees, so this is a GIF it's just going back and forth. An individual bee comes out of this one. Another bee goes into that little white one back there, right there. So these are solitary bees. They're not interacting with each other, but they found a spot of ground that they really like, and they make kind of a bee neighborhood. Each bee has its own individual nest, and it brings pollen and nectar into its own individual nest. So they are still solitary bees. So 80% of the bees in North America are solitary ground nesting bees. They nest in the ground. There are other bees that are still solitary bees, but they nest in pre-existing cavities, like a hole in a piece of wood. In the wild, these cavity nesting bees might find an abandoned beetle burrow and then move in and manipulate it to fit their needs. This is a leafcutter bee, and the way they manipulate these cavities is they cut pieces of leaves and they use it kind of like wallpaper to line the outside of their nest. So these are still solitary bees, but they don't live in the ground. We know that honeybees live in big hives. Here's some, beehives that we traditionally think of. In case you're wondering what it looks like inside these solitary bee nests, there's lots of variations to this main idea. But most ground nesting bees, they have a main tunnel. Down from that main tunnel, they make a couple little rooms. In each little room, it's kind of like a nursery. They will put pollen and nectar into that room, lay an egg on it, and then kind of close that room off. And so this is the general idea for ground nesting bees. These cavity nesting bees don't have the freedom to branch off. They actually don't have strong enough mouths to chew through the wood. So they just have to use the hole that's in there. If you look inside that hole, they basically are doing this. They go to the back of the hole, they put pollen and nectar in there, they surround it in a little room of leaves, they put a wall there and do it again and again and again. Then when you're getting near the entrance to the nest, they put a big plug of leaves, and that is their nest. You can see right there, that is a baby bee, a bee larva. It looks kind of like a maggot. That is eating the pollen and nectar that was left for it by its mom. So this is how solitary bees live. There's no queen, there's no hive, there's no workers. Well, there is a queen and a worker, but it's all one person, or one bee. So another difference between native bees and honeybees that we don't often recognize is that native bees have a short flight season. Honeybees, at least as a colony, they'll live for several years. And so they have a long flight season across many individuals. The S got cut off. So that means that their honeybees will be out. I had friends whose honeybees were out last week, right before it snowed, when it was a little bit warm. So honeybees are active as long as it's above 50-ish degrees, and they will be active perpetually until it gets too cold. Native bees, most of the time the adult female native bee is active for a month, maybe 6 weeks, and that's it for the year. And so they have a different relationship with the flowers, because flowers, like the native bees, are also kind of ephemeral like that. You don't have many flowers out in the desert that are flowering the whole year long. You have spring flowers, and they attract the spring bees. You have late summer flowers, and they attract the late summer bees. And so without recognizing that, we might not be making the proper steps to account for or protect all of these different bees with their different floral preferences. So another difference is their diet. When I tell people I study bees, one of the main things they think about is honey, because that's a term that we often associate with bees, honey and stinging for some reason. So honeybees, it says down here that they eat honey. Native bees, they don't eat honey and they don't make honey. In fact, what they eat is pollen and nectar. As a baby, they'll eat this pollen cake. It's a mixture of pollen and nectar. As an adult, they mostly drink nectar, but some new research suggests that they're also eating some pollen at night in their little nest. They bring some home for themselves. We know that bees are associated with honey because cartoon bears for generations have taught us that. Bees and honey go together. But, kind of interesting to think about, one of the bees in North America makes honey. The rest of them do not. Another difference is honeybees are all about the same size. I call that honeybee-sized. Native bees come in a wide variety of sizes and shapes and colors. So these are two of my favorite native bees. This is the carpenter bee. This is sitting on a quarter. So you can kind of imagine a quarter, and that's a carpenter bee sitting on it. This is a fairy bee, and they are much smaller. than a carpenter bee. But as far as fairy bees go, that's kind of a medium-sized fairy bee. In fact, the smallest bee in North America is a fairy bee. This is it right here. It's about the size of George Washington's nose on that quarter. This is probably one of the smallest bees in the world, but that's kind of a hard thing to measure. But we know it's the smallest bee in North America. This one lives in Utah. It only lives down in St. George, but it also is in Arizona, parts of California, maybe over into Texas and New Mexico. So fairy bees, very cool, lots of diversity in sizes and shapes and colors. In fact, here's an example of some of the 4,000 different bee species that live in North America. I have scaled these pictures with each other. So we have a honeybee right there. If you're familiar with the honeybee size that I was talking about, that is the honeybee size. So some bees are way smaller than a honeybee. Some bees are way bigger than a honeybee. Also, notice the shapes and sizes and colors. When we see cartoon bees, they are generally black and yellow. If you look at these bees, very few of them are black and yellow with stripes. In fact, most bees are not black and yellow with stripes. Most of them are grayish, blackish, and various other colors. So there are a lot of cool bees out there. Across the country, these 4,000 species are not equally distributed. Studies show that everything east of the Mississippi River, and this is including Canada, but it just didn't look pretty on my map. So everything east of the Mississippi River, there's about 770 bee species. That's a lot of bees. But in just Utah alone, we have about 1,100 species. So we have 1.5 times as many bee species in Utah as the entire eastern United States, or eastern North America. So that's cool. We're a hot spot of bee diversity. And I'm going to come back to the Utah bees later in this talk. Often when I'm telling people about bees, they ask me this question: do they pollinate? Everybody knows that honeybees pollinate because they watched that bee movie, the cartoon. And so the answer is yes, bees pollinate. And the real answer is both honeybees and native bees can be excellent pollinators. And so I want to talk about some of the differences in their pollination abilities and some of these kind of new studies that have recently come out. Since I assume a lot of you have an affinity to honeybees, let's talk about honeybees first. Honeybees. Honeybee pollination services in the year 2000 was valued at $14.6 billion. That's a lot for agriculture. We know that honeybees are the main bee that's used in agriculture. We truck them in probably next week. Maybe they're being trucked right now. Almonds bloom pretty soon in California, and they take a lot of honeybees out there to pollinate almonds. So honeybees are important pollinators for our agriculture system. Currently, my colleague got this data, so if you disagree with it, I'll just give you her email. Currently, there are 2.5 million honeybee colonies in the US. There's a lot of honeybee colonies here. There's just some interesting studies. This is not a graph based on real data. This is our cartoon of a cartoon of real data. So what this is showing is the number of fruit or seeds produced up on this axis, the number of honeybees on this axis. What we want to show you with this is that as you increase the number of honeybees in a crop, you initially get a lot more fruit set or seed set, but it kind of plateaus. So at some point, even if you're adding more honeybees, you're not really adding a pollination benefit to that crop. You know, they're kind of saturated at some point. So that's what happens with honeybees. But when you add native bees to the mix, things change. For example, there's this study in Science, I think it's 2013, wild pollinators enhance the fruit set of crops regardless of honeybee abundance. So this is a really cool study because they looked at 600 different fields around the world, every continent except for Antarctica because there's not a lot of crops there. They looked at 41 crops that are animal pollinated. So they looked at annuals and perennials and seed crops and nut crops and fruit crops. They looked at a lot of different things to see how wild pollinators and honeybees and the abundance of honeybees, how they're influencing each other. So let's give you a couple of quotes from this study. First quote that I thought was really interesting. Overall, wild insects pollinated crops more effectively. An increase in wild insect visitation enhanced fruit set by twice as much as an equivalent increase in honeybee visitation. So if we look back at our graph, we have the honeybee curve that kind of plateaus at a certain point. If we add wild bees into the equation, we get another spike in the fruit set. So another quote from this: overall, wild insects pollinated crops more effectively. That was the beginning of the last quote I showed you. There's lots of studies on orchard crops. In some orchards, the pollination services that 100 honeybees can do, so this is 100 honeybees, 10 by 10, I actually counted them all. 100 honeybees can do a certain amount of pollination in an orchard. Studies have found that 2 mason bees can do the same amount of pollination as 100 honeybees. So yes, wild bees are pollinators, and in some cases they're really good pollinators. But taken together, honeybees and wild bees kind of can enhance the seed set or the fruit set in these crops. Another quote from that study, pollination by managed honeybees supplemented rather than substituted for pollination by wild insects. So this is something I really want you guys to think about. We often think of honeybees as the main pollinators because we use them as one of our main pollinators. But the studies suggest that instead of thinking of honeybees as the main pollinator, we should think of the wild bees or the wild insects as the main pollinator, and the honeybees are supplementing that main pollinator. But there is, of course, a caveat to this. We want to talk about why the wild bees are so important, why the wild bees are increasing the seed set or the fruit set. What's going on with these wild bees? And then I'll tell you about the caveat. So the presence of other kinds of bees often changes the behavior of honeybees. There's lots of studies about this, and I'm not going to go into the details, but there are studies on sunflowers. This one's just this year on cherries. This one is on, I can't remember what crop. But we see that the behavior of the honeybee is changing when wild bees are in the field also. For example, in sunflowers, when there's wild bees, this is a longhorn bee, and they really like sunflowers. That's the male. But when the wild bees are in the sunflower seeds, in the sunflower fields with the, let me say this again, I'm getting tongue twisted. When the wild bees are in the sunflower fields with the honeybees, it causes the honeybees to cross the rows more often than they would without the wild bees. In a lot of crops, you need to cross the rows to get effective pollination. And so the wild bees change the behavior of the honeybee so that they're actually doing a better job at pollinating that crop. So that's one thing that the wild bees will do, is they'll kind of almost push the honeybees to work in a different way that's better for the plants. Another reason that some of these wild bees can be really effective pollinator is because many native bees or wild bees are specialists. There's various levels of specialization. This bee right here is a squash bee. So this is a video of a squash bee. She's called a squash bee because she only visits squash flowers. So that's pumpkins and zucchinis and things like that. This is a zucchini in my backyard. So the female specializes on squash pollen. She only feeds her baby squash pollen. The studies show that males are actually really important pollinators of squash. The male will fly in here and attempt to mate. And because of this specialization, the male knows, I'm going to look for females in the squash flowers. He comes in here, tries to mate. She's cleaning herself right now, cleaning off that extra pollen that could be used to pollinate that squash. The male comes in here. He's not as clean. He's not cleaning himself. He just has one thing on his mind. The female's kicking him off. But then when he flies away and looks for another female that might be more receptive, he is in turn transferring a lot of pollen between those squash flowers. And so, as this study shows, there's a big value of male bees, especially these squash bees, in some squash fields. Interesting side note, squash bees are solitary ground nesting bees, and they nest right in that patch of squash, right in the pumpkin patch or right in the zucchini patch. Often, after the pumpkin season is over, the farmer will till that pumpkin patch. And you're tilling where the ground nesting bees are living. There's some interesting studies that show the depth that you set your tiller at can affect the recruitment, is that ecological term. It affects how many squash bees are there the next generation. And so squash bees will often nest 18 inches or deeper. But if you can till like more of a shallow tilling, even in your own yard, then you can preserve some of those nest cells that are waiting till the next squash season comes. So squash bees are important pollinators, and they are a native bee. So this specialization that some of these native bees have cause them to be really efficient pollinators in some crops. Also, some native bees have this ability called buzz pollination. Honeybees don't know how to buzz pollinate, and I'll walk you through it as I play this video. So this is a native polyester bee. It gets its name because it lines its nest with this plastic-like coating that looks kind of like polyester in someone's mind. I think we should have called them saran wrap bees because it looks more like saran wrap than polyester. It's a clear plastic wrap that you put over your leftovers. So this polyester bee is going to forage around the base of this tomatillo flower in my backyard. Tomatillo flowers and tomato flowers and other plants in that group, they don't let their pollen out very easily. In fact, you almost will never see a honeybee on a tomato flower because there's not a lot there for it. But some of these native bees can buzz pollinate, so they vibrate their body at a certain frequency, and it causes the pollen to come out. So I'm going to play this video. You'll see she's foraging around the bottom here. When she turns around facing this direction, I slow the video down. She starts to vibrate her abdomen at a frequency, and you see the pollen grains flying out of there. Do you see that? So she is a buzz pollinator. Studies show that on some crops, like blueberries and tomatillos and tomatoes, when you have buzz pollinators around, you get more fruit per plant, you get bigger fruit per plant. So buzz pollinators are important for some crops. like the few that I mentioned. Bumblebees are famous for their ability to buzz pollinate, but there are other smaller bees that also buzz pollinate. So all of this information that I've just thrown at you is basically to say that fruit set is at its greatest when honeybees and native bees complement each other. So native bees can provide insurance against honeybee losses, against climate change, and pesticide effects on honeybees. So native bees should definitely be considered when we are talking about pollination services. But now I need to talk about the context, because some of you might be wondering about this, like what about the almonds? What native bees pollinate almonds? So the context definitely matters, and in fact, the studies are pretty clear that in small fields with native vegetation bordering these fields, the native bees can do a majority of the pollination in those small fields. But not all fields are small fields like this. For example, that is somewhere in California, stolen from the internet. This is an almond orchard in bloom, which is probably next week. And you can see it's basically a really pretty sea of almond trees with flowers on them. There is not a lot of native vegetation surrounding these fields, maybe way over here in the distance. But the native bees are central place foragers. Not just native bees, but all bees are central place foragers, meaning they have a home, they leave that home to go forage, and they bring that food that they're foraging for back to their home. And so the farther away their home is, the less likely things will get pollinated. These trees out in the middle of the field that are far away from the home are going to have a lot less visitation from native bees than the trees on the edge of the field. Another problem with this kind of crop, with these big monocultures, is yes, during the few weeks when almonds are blooming in February, there's a lot of food there for bees. But this is just a satellite image from Google Earth of the same area. This is an almond field during the summertime. There are no flowers there. This is basically a desert for bees. There's nothing for the bees to eat. So these big monocultures, we won't get the same effect of honeybees and native bees synergistically working with each other. We have kind of built our system solely around honeybees, and then all the problems with honeybees cause the cost of pollination services to go up. The problem with honeybees, I mean, as we're moving them around and there's lots of disease being spread and lots of pathogens and pesticides and other things that are affecting them, we are doing ourselves a disservice because we're not utilizing the native bees that are here that are doing a really good job. So in agricultural settings, native bees and honeybees work together to have a nice, beautiful ending, right? But what about in wild settings? This is some foothills in California during the rare super blooms. This one was not the recent one. That's like 20 years ago. But what about these settings? How do honeybees and native bees interact outside of agricultural settings? So something to think about here. Since honeybees are not native and wild bees are native, the wild bees have evolved with the native flowers, and honeybees have not. Most of our agricultural crops are, well, I'm not going to say most. A portion of our agricultural crops are not native, and so honeybees work very well with those, being not native themselves. But you see crops that are native, like squashes, the native bees do a really good job at pollinating those. But so, let's talk about these wild settings and the effect of honeybees on native bees. There's just two studies I'll highlight. I have another one in a second. Seasonal variation in exploitative competition between honeybees and bumblebees. Basically what they found is that at certain times of the year, bumblebees and honeybees will compete, especially during the dry summer months, because there's less resources available. And so there is some competition between honeybees and native bees. This is just someone's dissertation from New Mexico. I can't remember the university. It says it somewhere. Nope. It's a really cool study, so I wanted to highlight it. My colleague Olivia helped out with this, and so that's why I have it in here. But basically what they looked at is 40 years of data comparing bees on sunflowers in this one plot. So they have data from 1970s, and then they resampled in 2015 and 2016. And now I have to give a little bit of a disclaimer here. This is not a causation type of study. This is a correlation study. So there's a correlation here. We don't know what's causing it. But basically in the 70s, which is this white bar, the total bees and a number of native bees were really pretty much the same thing. Most of the bees were native bees. There was very few honeybees on these sunflowers in the 70s. Then in the 2015 and 16 study, we found that honeybees made up a majority of the bees visiting those sunflowers, and there was a big drop in the native bees on those sunflowers. So here's the correlation, the rise in honeybees and the fall in native bees. We can't say, based on these data, we can't say that honeybees are causing the native bees to decline. Maybe there was something else causing the native bees to decline, and honeybees took advantage of the opening. So as a scientist, I'm not going to tell you honeybees are making native bees disappear, but there is this interesting relationship there. For some reason, there is less native bees, and there are more honeybees here. So there could be there is evidence of competition between honeybees and native bees, especially at certain times of the year. Also, there's this really interesting study. This is just this year. It comes out in March of this year, which is weird because that's next month. But it comes out. It's accepted in March. Oh no, this was last year. Sorry, I'm thinking 2019 still. Honeybees disrupt the structure and functionality of plant pollinator networks. So what does that mean? Well, basically, when honeybees are present in some of these wild settings, it interrupts the linkages between generalist bees and their plants. And so it disrupts this relationship between the wild bees and their plants. And what's interesting to me is that it reduces the fruit set in several native plants. So the competition between honeybees and native bees isn't just negatively affecting the native bees, it's also negatively affecting the native plants. So that's kind of an interesting study from last year. So there can be a negative effect of honeybees in these native habitats, in these natural habitats. It's especially true when the floral resources are patchy, so there's a limited resource for the native bees, or in areas, this is I think Death Valley, in areas where at certain times of the year there's a lot of flowers, at other times of the year there are no flowers. And so during these dry parts of the year, the competition really goes up between the native bees and the honeybees. And there are not as many native bees out because the native bees have kind of evolved with these changes in the seasonality of the plants. So I put this quote on here, and some of you might be offended, but let me explain it. I have chickens in my backyard, and I like my chickens sometimes. Right now, they don't lay very many eggs, so I don't really like them. Chickens are one of the most important birds in the world, I would say, as a non-bird person, because chickens provide food for a lot of people. They provide meat for a lot of people. Food and meat are the same, but chickens are important. That's what I'm trying to say. I also do like other birds, though. If I want to see more hummingbirds in my backyard or more warblers in my backyard, buying more chickens is not going to accomplish that goal. In fact, if I buy too many chickens, I won't see any warblers or hummingbirds in my backyard, right? So this quote, this is from, I didn't know where it was from for a long time. I just recently found out on Twitter that it's from a professor in England. Raising honeybees to save pollinators is like raising chickens to help birds. So honeybees are also very important pets. They are an agricultural commodity of sorts. They are kind of like a livestock, right? They're semi-domesticated. In North America, we can kind of think of them as a pet. They're not wild animals. There are some feral colonies of honeybees that will establish out in nature, but they are not nature in and of themselves. If you have cows and they get away from the rancher and they start living in the field, we don't think of them as wild animals. They're feral cows. Or house cats, right? There's lots of house cats that are wild, but we're not thinking of them as wild animals. So we need to rethink our thinking. I'm not telling you that honeybees are not important, and I'm not telling you that we should not have honeybees, but we need to not consider them the answer to saving pollinators. And the reason I bring this up is because I see it all over the place. A couple of years ago, there was a federal, not a mandate, a federal suggestion maybe, so we need to protect pollinators, and that quickly evolved into protecting honeybees and monarch butterflies. Honeybees and monarch butterflies are really cool, but as a native bee researcher, I was hoping there was going to be more focus on the other bees, you know? So anyway, there's my quote. You can hate me if you want, but I'm sticking with it. So I want to come back. This is not a good transition, but I'm going to come back to Utah. How was that? Utah bees, we have a lot of bees here. But just like across the United States, bees are not equally distributed. Better look at what time it is. Perfect. Bees are not equally distributed. In Utah, they're not equally distributed either. So I've done various bee studies or been fortunate enough to participate in various bee studies in Utah, and so I want to talk about some of those. So as I already mentioned, Utah is a hotspot of bee diversity. 25% of all known bee species from North America can be found in Utah. That's pretty impressive. I did a study in Dugway Proving Grounds. This is the slogan for Dugway Proving Grounds is the nation's chemical and biological defense proving grounds. It's an interesting, kind of scary place, but I was out there as an undergraduate studying bees on sand dunes, and I found 250 different bee species. Pretty impressive, a lot of bees that live there. I also did a study, I needed to mention, I forgot I added this. This is the stuff I added 3 hours ago now. So in Dugway, I found 30 different Perdita species. These are those fairy bees. The fairy bees are all in the genus Perdita. A pretty good, diverse community of Perdita species out in Dugway. I also found several range extensions, meaning bees that normally weren't known from the Great Basin habitat. I found several species that prior to my study were only known from the Great Plains on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. So that's kind of a big jump from only being known from here to being found in Dugway, which is not very similar habitat to the Great Plains. I also found some species that prior to my study were only known from the Mojave Desert. So some pretty cool things to find out in the Dugway study. I also did a study just a few years ago at Red Butte Gardens here. I just put a dot because I couldn't make the little polygon big enough or small enough. 127 bee species in Red Butte Garden. It's pretty good, especially if you look at what we found there. So nearly 75% of all the bee species known from Salt Lake County we found in Red Butte Garden. So just in that one little spot right up the hill, we found 75% of the diversity that's known from Salt Lake County. Now, there's not a lot of bee research done in Salt Lake County, so that could change as we learn more about the bees here, but it's pretty impressive. Another kind of thing I wanted to point out is there was a lot of spring bee species. Some bees only come out in the spring, for example, Andrena and Osmia, two different bee genera. Both of these were from Red Butte Gardens. They were really diverse up here. 20 different Andrena species and 15 different Osmia species were found in the gardens. So that was impressive. One thing that was interesting, though, is that I only found 3 Perdita species, those fairy bees. So out in Dugway, I found 30 species. In Red Butte, I found only 3. And it's kind of an interesting thing that me and Olivia, my colleague, have been thinking about, is we think that Perdita might be a good indicator species for urbanization and how it affects bees. There's several other studies, one from California, one from Arizona, that show in urbanized areas or more urbanized areas, Perdita seems to be one of the first bees to drop out of the community. So even though Red Butte is an awesome habitat, it is somewhat isolated from the rest of the Great Basin habitat. And so it's kind of an interesting finding. The last one I want to talk about, and I'll talk about this for the rest of the talk here, is the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. I was fortunate enough to be a technician on that study when I was an undergraduate, and then I have stuck with the data and the researchers for a long time, and I still work with it. We found 660 bee species in the Grand Staircase. That's a lot of bee species. This project was done by my colleague Olivia that I keep mentioning. This was her master's thesis. We went back for 4 years, all summer for 4 years with a team of like 11 researchers, and we caught a lot of bees and found some really cool stuff. We collected all over the monument. The yellow spots we went to every other week for the whole summer for 4 years. The orange spots were more opportunistic collecting, places that we would just visit when there was flowers there, and we wouldn't visit them when there was not flowers there. So we collected all over the place, and we found some cool things. We found 660 bee species. I've already mentioned that, but just to contrast it with the eastern United States, almost as many bee species in the Grand Staircase as the entire eastern US. That's really cool. It's a hot spot within a hot spot of bee diversity. Within these 660 species, we found 49 new species, formerly undescribed species, new to science. Scientists didn't know they existed until we did our study. That's a lot, 49 new species. We also found 150 what we call morphospecies. So a morphospecies is something that looks kind of different. It wasn't different enough to say, yes, this is for sure a new species, but it was different enough that we say it doesn't really match the other species that we know. So these 150 species, what that tells me as a researcher is those are species that we really need to look at. And the problem is pretty time consuming to determine if a bee is a new species or not. And so there's a lot of work still to be done on these Grand Staircase bees. You might know that a few years ago, the current administration reduced the boundary size of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, reduced it by about 50%. And so the white is the old boundary. These green are the new boundary of the Grand Staircase. They split it into 3 kind of units. I'm not exactly sure how it works here, but we have the Grand Staircase unit, Caparowitz unit, and Escalante Canyons unit. So this happened right when we were finishing up that study, right when we were publishing that study about the Grand Staircase bees. And so then we did a follow-up study and asked, well, what does this mean for those 660 species, right? Just so we have some background here, during the Clinton administration is when this was established, and part of that establishment and the management plan, it says this was established to protect the plants that live there. In fact, 87% of Utah's flowering plants can be found within the Grand Staircase boundaries. So it said it was to protect the plants and the pollinators that support them. So the pollinators were part of the initial establishment of the Grand Staircase National Monument. When they reduced the boundary size, pollinators weren't mentioned anywhere in the documentation. Even though our study from the early 2000s, that was made available to the BLM shortly after our study was done. So we can't say they didn't know about the pollinators, but they just didn't include them in their reduction assessment. So what does it mean for those pollinators? So I found that 84 bees, 84 species that were originally collected in that original monument boundaries, 84 species were only found in these yellow areas, in these now excluded lands. And so not all of these 84 species were rare. Some of them were common and just happened to not be collected in the green spots. But I wanted to look at who these 84 species were, who these species that are now in this excluded land. And when I say excluded, national monuments have certain protections afforded them, and these excluded lands might not have those protections. I say might not because there's ongoing stuff here. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with this. We do know that there's increased mining, potential increased mining activity, and some other activities I'll talk about. So when I looked at these 84 species, I found some interesting patterns. I found some species that were endemic to the Colorado Plateau, so they are only known from Colorado Plateau areas. That includes the Grand Staircase, but also places like Moab and Canyonlands and other places like that. That's these white dots here. So these are somewhat endemic to that physiographic region. I found some bee species that prior to our study were only known from the hot deserts, like the Sonoran or the Mojave deserts. And you can see kind of a concentration of these red dots, along this hole-in-the-rock road corridor. This is one of the main dirt roads that accesses the monument. A lot of these Mojave desert species that were found here. Kind of interesting because the next closest populations of these species are down by St. George. So that's quite a big distance from St. George, and it kind of indicates there's something special about that habitat there because it is supporting these unique bees. Also, we have lots of undescribed species and morphospecies, again, along that hole-in-the-rock road region. A blue square means this is where we collected an undescribed bee species that was not collected anywhere in these green areas. So there's some interesting bees that we should be aware of that are now no longer in that protected lands. And so we also need to realize that before this was made a monument, those unique bees were there before it was a monument, right? They were there before the protections were there. They have been there with the protections for the last 20 years or so, and now they're no longer protected by the boundary of the national monument. So what does that mean? Oh, I forgot, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This is a measure of the bee species richness, so how many bees we found at each spot. The bigger the circle, the more kinds of bees we found there. You see that in these protected lands, there are some good places for bees. A big dot means it's good habitat for bees. We also see some pretty big dots in these excluded lands, these lands that used to be part of the monument. So there are not only unique bees there are also rich and diverse bee communities there. So me and Olivia went back last summer as part of, there's a group of guys that are trying to make a documentary about this, so that's why we're wearing microphones. But we went back to see what's happening there and to resample some of our old spots. I wanted to show this picture because these are some of those chimney bees, those bees that make the chimneys above their nest. They like to nest in hard-packed soil. This is along the road that goes to the Spooky and Peekaboo slot canyons. This area is no longer in the National Monument boundaries. This is along the trail that goes to, what's the waterfall? Calf Creek Falls. When we were hiking up to Calf Creek Falls, we noticed these bees nesting here, so on our way back out, we lined the trail here because people were just walking over the nests. So this is still in Monument. This is now no longer in Monument. So what's going to happen to those bees? Well, unfortunately, 2 days after we shot this video, or this picture, they improved the road. And so improving the road for dirt roads can mean various things. We actually saw the sign right before we were going out into the backcountry that said they're going to improve the road. So we stopped here. We met the BLM ranger that was there. We showed him these nests. He let us put flagging on these bushes to mark it so the whatever was going to improve the road could go around that. We called our contacts with BLM and told them what we were doing, and then we went in the backcountry for 2 days. When we came back, I don't have pictures of it, this was improved. They have widened the road by about 10 feet. They dug the road down so far and widened it into those bush areas that we couldn't even find the bushes that we marked with flagging. They were all gone. And they put a new road base. It's still a dirt road, but they put new road base there. So these bees probably are not coming back. They're probably either dug up and dead or buried by several feet of road base. I do hope to go back this summer to see if they will reestablish, because this bee species is not a rare bee, but it is a unique bee. It's a cactus specialist. It only visits cactus flowers, and it's a nesting specialist that only nests in hard-packed dirt. So what might happen to this monument and these now no longer protected lands? Well, we know that some things are happening. In the original monument, there was a lot of restrictions on road improvement. This is a big tourist area, and so I understand why they wanted to improve the road. Lots of minivans with broken oil pans on this road. And now there no longer will be. But if we could recognize and be aware of these native bees, maybe we could make steps to minimize the damage to these big populations. I mean, they could have just built the road to the right just a little bit, right? It seems like it'd be easy, but I don't work on road stuff, so. Utah is unique, and I hope I've convinced you that some of these wild bees are cool. Utah is a big landscape, and there's still a lot not known. Here's me and Olivia walking down into the grand staircase to collect. There's a lot of stuff to do in Utah still. A lot of bees to discover, and a lot of patterns to uncover, and a lot of questions to ask about Utah's native bees. One of my suggestions I give to people is that we need to first be aware of these bees. There's lots of different kinds of bees, and as we become aware of them, we can then make steps to protect them, right? I have a couple more slides in here that I just added. Almost 5 o'clock. What time should I be done? 5-ish. I'll go 5 more minutes, and we'll try to be done. So one of the questions that people might be thinking to themselves is, what can I do? Right? That's a good question. Hopefully we're all thinking, what can I do? And we can actually take steps in our own yards to help the bees. So bees need 2 things, food and habitat. Food for bees is easy. You plant flowers. It's best to plant native flowers because these native bees have evolved with the native flowers. But there are lots of other flowers that are still good to support some of these bees. Red Butte Garden has a really nice, what's it called? The conservation garden that has a lot of good bee-friendly flowers. I would suggest you plant so do you. Oh yeah, the pollinator garden here. Where is it at? So I can tell people.
On the east side of the architecture building.
East side of the architecture building, there is a pollinator garden. It will give you good ideas of the kinds of plants you can plant to provide food for these native bees. I suggest planting a variety of flowers. Different bees have different preferences. Some like yellow flowers, some like purple flowers, some like tall, some like short. Variety of flowers will support a variety of bees. Specialists and generalists will go to different things. Also, you want flowers that are blooming at different times of the year. If you only have flowers in the spring, you won't be supporting any summertime bees. So it can be as easy as starting with a flower and then expanding out from there. Also, I have a pop quiz. Which of these sunflowers do you think is better for bees? Left or right? Yell it out. Very good. It is the left. This is a native sunflower. This is a cultivated sunflower. I specifically chose these 2 because there's a study that shows that there are a lot more bees on these on these native sunflowers than on the wild. I'm saying it backwards. These ones are better than these. It's partly because these don't make very much pollen. You can often tell when a flower is really hybridized because there's lots of really cool looking petal patterns. So this has 1 row of ray petals. This one has lots of different rows of ray and pseudo-ray petals, or I don't know what you call them. But that's not as good for bees. How about this one? 2 roses. Which one's better for bees? Right. The one on the right, that's a wild rose. This is a non-wild rose. I've never seen a bee on these roses. But I have seen lots of bees on the wild roses. So not every flower is good for bees, but don't feel overwhelmed. There's lots of lists out there. USDA has a list. My book has a list in the front. There's lots of ways to find out. Go to the pollinator garden and see what the bees are on, right? So you can start small and build up from there. So providing food for bees can be pretty easy. I did a study. I'm still finishing this study. I wanted to know what native bees go to milkweed. A lot of people are planting milkweed to support monarchs. There's a monarch caterpillar that eats milkweed. This is a push all around the world because monarch butterflies are in decline. So if we plant milkweed, I wanted to know, well, how is that supporting native bees? And so this is some milkweed from out in Tooele County, where I live, and you can see 3 different native bee species on here. There are 2 longhorn bees, and then this is a cuckoo bee. So milkweed can be a cool flower because you can accomplish 2 things. You can help support monarchs, and you can support some native bees. Also, sometimes native bees and honeybees get their feet stuck in milkweed and die. But the milkweed has an interesting pollination system, and they have these weird pollen packets. So sometimes you'll see a dead bee on milkweed, but it's okay because it's still supporting some of the other bees. You do believe me. In addition to flowers, we want to provide nesting habitat. Now this one can be a little bit trickier. If we leave bare dirt, bees will nest in that bare dirt. This homeowner has avoided putting thick layers of mulch or ground cloth down and instead left bare dirt, and we have some native sweat bees nesting in that bare dirt. Not everyone wants just bare dirt in their yard, but a lot of ground nesting bees love bare, sunny patches of dirt. If you don't want it in your flower bed, maybe you could try the back corner of your yard in a sunny spot. Leave some bare dirt, and native bees will find it and nest in it. If you don't want dirt in your yard, because I understand that we want our yards to look a certain way, you can make a bee nest block, bee nest box. I call these bee hotels because I think it sounds cool. You can buy these online. You can buy them at various nurseries around town. I think Costco even had them, or it's really easy to make them. You can have the kind like this that you have like kind of hollow straws. These ones look like they're bamboo or something similar to it. Or you can take a block of wood and drill holes in it. This is a block of wood from my backyard, and I drilled holes in it. The different diameters of holes will attract different sizes of bees. These are 2 leafcutter bees nesting in my bee hotel. I've gotten even lazier, and I make bundles of Phragmites. So this is a new bee hotel I have in my yard. There's a leafcutter bee going in there. Phragmites is an invasive reed, and we don't want it here, but we can use the stems of the Phragmites to make these bee hotels. You cut them to a certain length, maybe 8 to 10 inches, and I just bundle them together, and I have, oh, this is a video, and I have my bee hotel. You can see these ones are used. They're plugged up by leaves. This is a leafcutter bee looking for her home, and it's fun to watch. I'm standing, or my camera is standing, 6 inches away from this, and she doesn't care. It's really fun. They're pretty docile, they're pretty tame, and it's really cool to watch, and my kids like it too. Also, as a biologist who doesn't just like bees, I also like wasps. The video's going to end pretty soon, I think. I'll just make it end. You also get other things that nest in your bee hotel. This is a solitary wasp, solitary meaning it lives by itself. This is called a grass-carrying wasp. They carry grass. That's why they get their name. But what they do is they find this hole. They hunt tree crickets, which look kind of like little katydids. They hunt tree crickets, they paralyze them, they shove it down in that hole, and then they take pieces of dead grass and shove it in front of that tree cricket after they laid an egg. So they lay their egg on a paralyzed tree cricket, and their babies eat the paralyzed tree cricket. It's really cool. And I have leafcutter bees and grass-carrying wasps nesting together. One thing to think about if you're going to put these bee hotels in your yard, you do sometimes get parasitic wasps or parasitic bees that will attack your residents of your hotel. There's various ways you can minimize this. I am not a very hands-on hotel owner, so I just leave them out, and I enjoy watching the parasites as well as the hosts because it's nature. But you can do various things. If you make a new bee hotel every other year, you move it to different spots. Sometimes people will take these apart and dissect them, and you can look at the pupae in there and try to take out the pupae that don't look right, or take out the moldy ones, because you will, like with anything, as you increase the density of a species, you're going to increase the probability of getting pathogens or parasites in these areas. So the bee hotels are cool, but they can also increase the parasite load on some of these residents. So my last slide, I think, is this is my message to you. There are a lot of things we could do. If it seems overwhelming, let's start by being aware of bee diversity. I had to put the pun in there one more time. When we recognize them, a lot of really cool things can happen. If you like bird watching, try bee watching, right? You sit in your flowers and just see what you see there. Most of these bees are smaller than honeybees, and they are in your yard, and we just overlook them. We just don't notice them. And there's really cool stuff, metallic green and blue and little teeny yellow bees, and lots of really fun things to watch. I have told people in the past that I got into bees because it's like watching any primetime TV show with the drama and intrigue and suspense, but with no commercials. And that's what it is like. You can see them nesting in your yard, and you can watch the velvet ants chasing the bees in your yard. Velvet ants are parasites of bees. And now, let me make sure these are all right. So we have the blog. This is our website, and we don't maintain the blog very well. We have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and we're just starting YouTube, but it takes time, and so there's only a couple videos on there. But there will be more, so feel free to follow us on these things or ask questions to us through those things. We also have an email that somehow disappeared in there, but it's a Gmail. It's thebeesinyourbackyard@gmail.com. So I went a little bit over 5 o'clock, but we still have some time for questions, and I would love to answer them, or try.
the microphone to you because we're actually recording this for future people. So,
Oh, are you? Nice. I should be recording it for YouTube. I don't know how to do that, but I will try. Okay.
Are the
Please.
native bees susceptible to the same diseases that are hurting the honeybees?
Oh, that's a great question.
Mites and parasites?
Yeah, so we
and-
know there's a lot of things that affect honeybees negatively. Mites and parasites and funguses and things like that. Most of them don't seem to affect native bees. There are some that seem to be transferring from native bees to bumblebees, for example. But varroa mite is not one. The varroa mite does not affect native bees. I think part of the difficulty in knowing how much it affects it is because most native bees are solitary. It's hard to test how, like if a native bee and its nest gets infected with a pathogen, we would probably never know unless you're actively monitoring that one bee. But with a honeybee hive, you can tell if it's affected because you are more actively involved with the hive. But so it seems like mostly no. Most of the pathogens and parasites that affect honeybees probably do not affect native bees. Please.
Hi, that was great. So the amazing species diversity of bees in Utah, does that say more about Utah or does it say something more about the eastern United States and the urbanization over there?
It's actually probably more about Utah than urbanization in the east. So bees around the world are most diverse in desert and Mediterranean landscapes. So, hey, I know that song. I have it on one of my bee videos. That's funny. So bees are more diverse in deserts and Mediterranean dry areas. There's in fact more kinds of bees in the deserts than there are in the jungles. And so we think of jungles as the diverse areas of the world. Utah is a jungle for bees as a metaphor. And that's probably because since 80% of the bees are nesting in the ground, deserts provide, or dry areas provide a better area to nest in the ground. There's going to be less fungus problems, but there's also a big diversity of soil types and habitat types and elevational gradients, especially in Utah. And so we have this interesting mix of habitats that make Utah kind of unique among western states even, that we have a lot of different bees that Utah can support. Utah is a kind of an artificial boundary, but some research that we're currently doing shows that the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin are two of the most diverse ecoregions for bees. Other questions? There was one up here, I think. There's a couple.
Let's go.
I think
Is there one over here?
this lady right here was first.
How about Africanized bees?
Africanized bees. So I am not a honeybee specialist, as you might have guessed, because I probably said something wrong, and some of you beekeepers are like, what? Africanized bees, or killer bees, also known as, right? They are a honeybee. They're the same species as the honeybee that you have in your hives here on campus. They are just a different race of honeybees, a different variety, so to speak. They are from Africa, and they work really hard. A researcher, I think it was a researcher from Brazil, thought if I breed the European varieties that we're used to with the African ones, I could get some really hard-working bees. And he did. They are really hard-working bees, but they are also more aggressive. And so they have a less tolerance for us bothering them. They're not more toxic or anything like that, but they have a more aggressive response for when they are trying to protect their hive. I have a friend who did his graduate work in Southern California on honeybees, and most of his hives were Africanized, and he still harvested honey from them and still worked with them with gloves and a veil. But it sounds scarier than maybe it is. They're also, because they're more aggressive, they don't do well in colder climates like Salt Lake City. There will be Africanized bees in St. George and places like that, probably Kanab, where it doesn't get quite, Kanab gets cold. But in St. George, because in the cold weather, they don't last through the winter as well as the European varieties. Did I say anything wrong?
One thing I would add is that if you think about where humans evolved, right, we evolved in Africa as well, and so those honeybees have been around humans a lot longer, and humans have known for many, many millennia to drain honeybees for a really nice sweet treat. So that there is a theory that is why they are indeed more aggressive. They evolved to defend their hives from humans.
So it's our fault. Other questions? There's one in the back, but there was also two up here, so I think these guys were first. Sorry. That's okay. It's okay. We have time.
We'll get to that.
We have till 5:30, right? Yep. So we have 20 minutes.
Are there any specific local food sources that are at risk if we let specific native bees go extinct?
Let's see, that's a good question. Are there specific local food sources that might be at risk? Probably not, because most of our food that we're growing here is not well adapted to Utah and not well adapted to Utah's bees. If you look at the major crops in Utah, I think one of the major ones is alfalfa, which is not fed, we don't eat it as humans. There are native bees that are really good at pollinating alfalfa. Alfalfa is a weird flower, so when you open the flower, it has a little, I think it's the stamens or some other reproductive structure that kind of comes out. And if you're a honeybee, you open the flower and it flips you in the head and you hate it. And so you go around the side and you chew a hole in it and you steal the nectar. So honeybees are not very good for alfalfa flowers, but some of the native bees have a little bit of a fancier little jig that they do to get into those flowers, and they don't get flipped in the head. So alfalfa leaf-cutting bees are good at pollinating alfalfa. There's also some native bees like the alkali sweat bee that we have in Utah, but it's higher concentrations in Washington that are good. But so they're really the native bees. They make our smaller crops like the orchards, which we do have in Utah. They will really benefit from native bees, but there are a variety of kinds of native bees that assist in the pollination. So there's not one that we need to necessarily I don't want to say it that way. That we shouldn't. We need to care about every one, but there's not one that the crop relies on. Maybe I'll say it that way. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Hi, so I work on native bee conservation in the Colorado Plateau, and I just, one issue that I work on specifically is the threat of commercial beekeeping on public lands.
Yes.
So just to give a little bit of background on that, if that's all right.
Please.
So a number of large commercial beekeeping operations, so honey beekeeping operations, are requesting permits from the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management to put their hives on Utah and Arizona's public lands, so like our national forests. And that's a particular concern. You talked a little bit about the competition and the disease transmission between honeybees and native bees. I just wanted to kind of bring that up and ask if you wanted to talk about that and why that might be of concern.
No, I appreciate you bringing it up. So if I try hard to not be anti-honeybee, because a lot of native bee researchers are anti-honeybee. I think that what we need to consider, though, is in circumstances like this, when commercial beekeepers are wanting to put their apiaries on public land, we need to be aware that each beehive has 50,000 bees in it. And so when you put a beehive out there, you need to feed 50,000 bees. And if you put 20 hives on there, you need to feed 50,000 times 20. I'm not going to do the math. And so at certain times of the year, that might be fine, right? When there's a lot of floral resources, we can support honeybees and native bees. But Utah has a very bimodal distribution in flower diversity. So we have a spring bloom, and we have a lot of flowers in the spring. We have a late summer bloom when the rabbit brush blooms, and we can support a lot of bees then. July, there's not a lot of flowers blooming out in our public lands. And so we need to be aware of this when we are making decisions on what we can do. And not only with the commercial beekeeping, but even those of you that might be backyard beekeepers. We need to be aware that we need to have food for those bees, for our pet bees, and for the native bees that live in our backyard. And so there's not like an equation that I know of that tells you how many flowers you need per bee, but we should be aware that we are feeding a lot of bees. What should I send them to if someone wants to talk to somebody about these?
Yeah, you'd be welcome to come and talk to me afterward. That would be great. You can also look up, I work with the Grand Canyon Trust, and you look up Grand Canyon Trust honeybees or bees, and can get a little more information there. Thanks so much.
Yep. Christy had a question over here. 3 questions.
I was curious about your sampling technique in the different locations where you sampled. Did you just use simple pollinator traps? Where did you deposit your specimens? And did you database them, and is the data available online?
So I will start with the second question. Most of these studies were done in conjunction with the USDA. It's not called the Bee Biology Lab, it's the Pollinating Insect Research Unit up in Logan, Utah. We call it the Bee Lab. So most of the specimens are up in the Bee Lab. The Red Butte Garden specimens are with my colleague Olivia down in New Mexico. The Bee Lab specimens are somewhat data-based, and some of that data has been deposited at things like GBIF, and SCAN has some of them. There is some resistance from the USDA folks to database all of their collection or to make it freely available, because there's a weird thing that scientists do when they feel some ownership of their data and they don't want to share it. And I get that because you've worked hard to get it, but so we're working on it, right? The sampling technique was, 20 years ago, a bunch of bee researchers got together and tried to make a standardized kind of protocol to sample. Red Butte Gardens didn't lend itself well to that standard protocol. The standard protocol is you have a 1 hectare plot, 100 meters by 100 meters, and you sample for 20 minutes in each half of that plot.
When you say sample, you mean net?
You net collect bees on flowers, because it's important to know which bees are visiting which flowers, and so we would record that. We would say, okay, all these were caught on indigo bush in this one plot on this date, and we would do 2 samplings per day, one before noon and one after noon. Some bees are early risers, and some bees wait until it's 100 degrees to come out. And so we had this sampling protocol to try to get as much of the diversity in the plot as possible. So we would sample on as many flowers as possible with the aerial net. Other plots, like the ones in Dugway, we also did traps. Pan traps are colored plastic bowls full of soapy water, and we would put those in a big X across the plot. And then it's like kind of a passive sampling method. So 2 samplers, 2 net collectors in each plot for 40 minutes twice a day. And then the pan traps were left out during bankers' hours, basically, 8 hours a day. And so then you can catch maybe the more rare things that you might not catch with your net. But there's discrepancies between those. The pan traps sometimes catch way more of a certain species than you caught with your net. So then the question is, are the pan traps catching more than there really are there, like they're attracting them in, or do you just miss them with your net? Some bees just don't go to the traps. The polyester bees, they seem to not like those pan traps. And so we tried to do somewhat standardized collecting. A Red Butte was hard because a 1 hectare plot, it's like 1 million flowers in 1 hectare. And so we did more transects, and just because the goal in Red Butte, this was the initial study, was to say, what are some bees that are here? And so we were just doing net sampling, and we came once a month for 4 months and just caught what we could. So it's tricky because we really want to be able to have comparable data sets between the plots, but often the funding entity has different goals, and so we try to do a variety of things. So I can tell you more about it later. Yeah. Oh, I was going to call on you. There was someone over there that hasn't been able to ask one yet, if that's all right.
I was just curious about if you've been able to prove that some of the native species are more effective with something like almonds as versus honeybees, because obviously I think they probably just got in this mode of, the farms got bigger, they needed to bring in pollinators.
Yeah.
But I think if someone could prove to the almond growers that it was viable, they might section off a little bit for the native bees. I'm just curious if anyone has ever quantified that.
People are trying to, and there's been a lot of work done on other crops, not almond crops. A lot of it's done on the blue orchard bee. Have you guys heard of the blue orchard bee? That is a species of mason bee that's native to North America. And so there's a lot of data with the blue orchard bee. That's when the 100 versus 2 was based on, I think that was an apple orchard. But so there is some people doing that kind of quantifications. The tricky part with almonds specifically, or for any commercial grower, is it's based on money, unfortunately, right? If it's going to be cost effective, even those that are environmentally conscious, they want to help the bees, there still is a cost associated with this. So the USDA actually up in Logan has been doing a lot of work with the almond growers with blue orchard bees. The tricky part is that almonds are not native to North America, and they bloom in February, which is earlier than most native bees come out. And so they have been they've worked for years to try to get blue orchard bees, because blue orchard bees are really good pollinators of almonds. But you have to trick them into coming out earlier than they normally would. So they were putting them in giant refrigerators and then taking them out of the giant refrigerators to try to tell them, hey, it's time to wake up. And then they would have to put those out in the field. And it worked, and they could get good pollination services. But then it was hard for them to get the blue orchard bees to come back and re-nest in their artificial nest boxes. So there is work being done on it. At this point, it's not financially enticing enough to the big almond growers to make a big switch. I'm not an agriculturalist, but my view is the best way to do it is smaller fields. Smaller fields with hedgerows or strips of native habitat, in the fields. There's lots of problems that go along with that. If you put native vegetation through your almond orchard, you're also introducing potential weeds and potential pests and other things like that. But you are also introducing native bees, which will do a good job at pollinating stuff. Oh.
I just want to, Tom, will you stand up for a second? Yeah, of course. I just wanted to make a shout out. This is Tom Bench. He's actually the founder of the U of U Beekeeping Association in 2012.
Oh, nice.
He and I started, this group. I'm the faculty advisor. My name is Amy Sibler, if you don't already know, but I'm glad Tom's here, and I wanted Joe to know that.
That's awesome. Thank you. Other questions? I saw some people put their hands up.
I saw that you said that leaving a bare patch of soil in your garden could help with bees, and I remember reading a study that like pebble mulching, so like partially covering soil, could increase the density of bees. And I was wondering if that applies to Utah and like what you know about that.
I don't know much about it, but I do know that Utah has 1,100 species of bees, and most of them nest in the ground, but they all have different preferences. Some bees only want bare open dirt. Some want leaf litter, and they go under a leaf, then dig a hole. Some want in the shade of a bush. So there's lots of diversity in the nesting preferences. I have seen them, some native bees will nest in your lawn, and they don't even care. Other ones I've seen like up at Utah State, up in Logan, we have this, they put like river gravel, like kind of the big piece of rock, they put that in an area, and bees are nesting in it. And so I don't know, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but so it looks like, so that you read about partially covering things with gravel?
Yeah, it was like covering the soil by like 60 to 80% or something like that with like medium-sized landscaping rocks.
It probably could attract some bees.
Yeah, it didn't talk about like specific species. It just said like increase the density of ground. So just saying.
Yeah, and so the density is also tricky. So I did a little mini study in someone's yard here in a sugar house, and she had these native sweat bees nesting in all over her front yard. But some sweat bees are actually social. And so the density is a tricky thing because it was kind of one colony with like 300 nest entrances. And so it could be that. And they do nest in areas with a varied landscape. Those sweat bees do. At least those sweat bees did. So I say try it and see what happens. Yes. There's a mic right behind you.
I want to thank you for talking about Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument and the reduction in size there, and the importance of that area for its biological diversity and also cultural and archaeology there. Just today, the Bureau of Land Management released a new management plan for that monument.
I didn't see it.
And it allows more extractive activities, mining, roads, grazing, all that kind of stuff. So the potential damage you talked about could be about to happen. I hope that we can get the boundaries restored to the original boundaries of Grand Staircase, because that is an amazing place that is worthy of protection.
It is, it totally is. And Bears Ears too, some of you might be thinking about Bears Ears. We haven't done any bee research over in Bears Ears, and I would really like to. There's, I think, more potential for a higher diversity of bees in that Bears Ears region. There's a kind of a greater elevational gradient there, and it should be one of the, it should have more species than the Grand Staircase does. So all over that southeastern Utah, there's a lot of really special areas, not only for bees, but for everything else. So I think that, as citizens of Utah, we can celebrate this diversity and try to make it part of what we think about. We're the beehive state. And if you think of beehive as a metaphor to lots of bees, we have lots of bees. And so it's something that I hope we can get more awareness of, and then maybe we can start making some changes as we start recognizing that diversity. Because you can imagine places like Moab on a trail, instead of just interpretive signs about whatever their interpretive signs are about, have an interpretive sign about bees. Maybe there's bees nesting right there. That would be a really cool opportunity to teach people about some of these native bees and make them stop and say, oh wow, I didn't know there was bees in the ground. Because that's what they will probably say.
Oh yeah, I have a follow-up question about the Grand Staircase study.
Yeah.
So you found so many new species of bees, and do you know anything about how specific the bees are for the plants that they're feeding on?
Well, so that is a great question. So unfortunately, for all of the 4,000 species in North America, we know painfully little about most of them as far as their biology and ecology go. So we know that, I mean, it's hard to exactly know how specific the bees are to plants because the way we're testing this is we catch them with a net and we keep record of what plant we caught them on. And so we can say, oh, we caught 90% of these bees on this single plant, so they might be a specialist. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're like genetically a specialist. We do know that some bees are genetically pre-programmed to be a specialist. You can take a specialist bee off as an egg, feed it a different pollen. When it grows up to an adult bee, it will only eat the pollen that its ancestors ate, even though it's never tasted it before or seen it before. So a lot of these specialist bees are genetically pre-programmed to be specialists. With a lot of these new species, we know almost nothing about them. We can guess based on their relatives, but there's still so much work to be done on just the grand staircase data.
Well, I'm asking the question because I'm a botanist, and the Colorado Plateau is full of endemic species.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that had to do with endemism of bees, too.
It probably is related. Most bees are specialists at the genus level. Some of them are specialists at the family level, which is giant, like sunflower specialists, like anything that looks like a sunflower. But a lot of bees are specialists at the genus level, but they don't seem to be species specific. So a lot of the endemism in plants seems to be, there's an endemic, so for example, in St. George, and I just know because I've been thinking about it, St. George, there's a globe mallow that's endangered there. Globe mallow is the genus Sphaeralcea. It's a really great bee plant. The bees that will go on that endemic endangered Sphaeralcea will also go to the widespread Sphaeralcea around. And so they are benefiting the endangered one, but they are not reliant on the endangered one, if that answers your question. We have 4 minutes.
Yeah, maybe 2 more questions.
Well, how about we go right here, and then there's one in the back, and then we'll cut off the questions.
Thanks. I was just wondering about maybe the effect of climate change on bees.
Yeah, climate change on bees. There's a study that just came out today that I haven't read yet, but it suggests that climate change is negatively affecting bumblebees. The tricky part is the news, I'm not going to say we because I'm not going to blame the scientists, but the news likes to generalize things. Like climate change is negatively affecting bumblebees. There are a lot of kinds of bumblebees. In North America, there's 55 so species. Is climate change negatively affecting all of those bumblebees? And the answer is we don't know. Climate change so it's kind of like, I think of this question like maybe how might climate change affect birds? And the answer is going to be, it really depends on the bird. Some birds might do really well with climate change and expand their range, right? A lot of other birds are going to be pushed out of their niche and they're going to potentially go locally extinct or extinct. Same thing with bees. Some bees are going to do really well. Bees like hot, dry areas, and so as some areas dry, like the Great Plains, maybe you'll get more bee diversity there. Other bees that are endemic to mountaintops, like other mountaintop endemics, will be pushed off those mountaintops as the climate warms. And so it will be a mixed bag. This study today, from the abstract that I read, it looks like it's not necessarily the warming that's harming some of these bumblebee populations. It's the extremes, that maybe these populations aren't able to withstand some of the extreme climate events that are happening with climate change. But again, I haven't read the study yet. I heard about it on NPR on my drive up. So I will read it. So the question was, have any bees gone extinct? The problem is we don't know. We don't even know how many bees live in Utah. I did a study in the backyard of the Twilla campus, and I found a genus of bees that previous to our study wasn't known from Utah. So there's so much unknown that we can't, it's really hard to reliably even say that bees are declining because there's not research done on 99.5% of them. I don't know, it's just a fake statistic, but it's mostly true. We don't know for most things, so we can't say if they've gone extinct because we haven't been monitoring them enough. Monitoring for bees is a costly, time-consuming thing, and most grad students don't have the funding for it. Most professors don't have the time for it, and so it's a tricky thing. There's some citizen science efforts to look at bees, but identifying bees is really hard for a specialist, and it's really, really hard for a non-specialist, so it's tricky. We have one more question, and then we're going to cut it off, and we're going to go back in the back corner. If you can yell out, I'll repeat your question so we don't have to...
My question was just about fire, if anyone's doing any studies on ground nesting bees
Yes, the question was about fire. How might fire affect ground nesting bees? There is some research being done, again, out of the USDA Bee Lab in Logan. There was I don't know if he's a grad student or a postdoc that has looked at some of that. Some of the publications show that a lot of these native bees can withstand fire. The tricky part is they're kind of manipulative studies, and they're not necessarily true to nature. We could be fairly sure that in fire-adapted habitats, like the chaparral of California, the native bees to that area have evolved with fire, and so they are probably also fire adapted. Most native bees nest between 3 inches and a couple feet under the ground, so most of those will be fine with most fires. The deepest nest that we found was 9 feet deep. We, meaning bee researchers. It was down in central Utah in a dirt road, and I saw the picture of these guys in the 80s digging it up, and it was 9 feet deep. The bee is about 1/4 of an inch long. They think it might be multiple generations of bees that happen to just use the same nest entrance and keep digging. But yeah, so for the ground nesting bees, they seem to be pretty resistant to fire. With the changing fire regimes of the Great Basin, though, with cheatgrass, we're not sure how that might affect them. Because some of them are pretty, 3 inches isn't that deep. But it depends on the type of fire. There is some research being done, though. And there probably will be more. I know there's some bee researchers in Australia that are asking that kind of question with these new fires. So that's probably it. Thank you guys for coming. That was fun.
Perfect. We are so lucky to have Joe here today. We just want to thank you for coming, supporting, being a part of the bee community. Hopefully you learned a little bit. We'll be in the back if you want to chat. And let's give Joe one more round of applause. Thank you.